Well, hello friends and welcome to Ask Zach. Today we're going to talk about JBL speakers. We're going to dispel some myths about them being bright or harsh sounding. We're going to talk about the history. We're going to talk about players that have used them through the years, which you may be surprised how many players have used them. And part of the point of this is showcasing the fact that although JBL has left the musical instrument realm, they no longer make speakers for guitar amps or anything like that, that they were once really the speaker of the pros. They were the speakers that you saw in top of the line amps, and what even guys would take out stock speakers and put JBL speakers in them for many years, for decades, even for 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s. JBL speakers were kind of seen as the top of the heap. So we're going to talk about that, talk about even the weight of them, how, because JBLs kind of get really strong reactions from guitarists, because you have the guys that love them and know them. You have the guys that know them and hate them and will say things like they're harsh and they're boat anchors and they're horrible. And then you have all the guys that have never played through one before, and all they can go on is the opinion of others. And so we're gonna work through all that. So while you're thinking about it, if you haven't done it already, and if you're enjoying the show, well, please go down in the corner and subscribe. I appreciate that. If you've already subscribed, then I appreciate you supporting the show. And there's multiple ways. The best is Patreon. And for that, you'll find the information in the description of this video. Then there's other ways. There's tip jar information in the description. Also, there's merch like this. It's a sickness shirt. Again, you can find that down below at askzach.com on our website. Also, just a reminder, there are tons of articles that I've written through the years that I've put up on my website and additional information. And sometimes even on videos, I'll have additional pictures and such to flesh out some of these videos that I do. So check that out. All right, so I guess we'll start some with the history of JBL. Now, I'm not going to go full-blown, Keith Williams 5-watt world on this, but it's tempting to, but I'll let him do that. JBL really gets going in the speaker world when they introduced the D130 15-inch speaker, and they introduced that in 1947, 1948, and it is the first cast frame speaker. Okay, so here's the deal. There's cast frame and there's pressed frame. So most of the speakers you're familiar with, so those would be like Jensen's, Oxfords, Utahs, Celestions. Most of these speakers are steel that's pressed or bent into the shape of a speaker, and then they put the cone and everything else on it. A cast frame speaker is where they have a mold and they have liquid metal and they pour it into the mold. Okay, it's cast. One is much more expensive than the other. And I think you can guess that the cast frame is more expensive to make. And also it's going to be heavier because you're going to use thin metal to bend and press. You're going to use at least aluminum or something else for a cast frame speaker. So JBL introduces this cast frame speaker, the D130, and again, this is the late 1940s. It can take a whopping 20 or 30 watts, which is a huge deal. It's an Alnico magnet, and it soon becomes one of the premier speakers to use in PA systems. Now, of course, you have guitar amplifiers that are starting to get going. You have Gibson and other manufacturers that are making guitar amps at this point. You have Fender coming in, and Fender's mainly using Jensen's, and part of that is the expense, because a JBL speaker is so much more expensive than a Jensen. The first guitar amp manufacturer to use JBL speakers in their amps is not Fender. It is a smaller company in California by the name of Standell. Standell was started by a guy named Bob Crooks, and for a while, Standell amps were considered the premier, amp for guitar players, especially hot guitar players. So, and of course, this is kind of pre-rock and roll. So you have guys like Merle Travis or Joe Maphis or Speedy West, Hank Garland, Grady Martin, on and on and on. Tons of steel players. Buddy Emmons used a Standell for a long time. Chet Atkins used a Standell amp. And in fact, he loved his Standell amp so much from the 50s with the JBL D130 in it that he used it for his entire career, especially for recording. So he really didn't take it out live. Live, he would use, Baldwin or Gretsch amps or, whatever he had an endorsement with. Sometimes it was Music Man or PV or what have you. But when he recorded, he used a 50s Standell amplifier with a JBL D130 in it. All right, so Fender, Leo, was not willing to, really, buy into the JBL thing because of how expensive the speaker was and how much he would have to charge. So he does things like with the Bassman, he uses four, Jensen's 4 10-inch speakers, trying to get tightness and cleanness in the low end, because that was what the JBL was offering over what, a Jensen and a Fender amp could do. So he kind of continues on until 59, when finally Leo decides to make an amp with a D130 in it. And it's the Vibrasonic. And the Vibrasonic was the first of the Brown Tolex amps. It was the first of the amps with first Fender amp with forward-facing knobs. And it came stock with a JBL D130. And as such, it was the top of the line amp, even though it wasn't the most powerful, but because it had the new features, and of course it had that JBL speaker. So it was the most expensive Fender amp when it was introduced. And even though they say 59, they really, as far as all the information I can find, they didn't start shipping until 1960. Soon Fender followed that with another amp using the JBL, and that was the Showman amp. So the Showman also came with a D130 in it. Okay, now we get to the whole F series and how this came about. And there's all sorts of misnomers and rumors and all sorts of such. And really, as far as I can tell, and as far as the research that I've done, and according to Harvey Gerst, who was employed by JBL, he indicates that he worked in the warranty department. And they started seeing JBLs coming back that were out of Fender amps. So by this point, they have the D130 15 and they have the D131, which was the 12-inch version of it. I know that's confusing, but those were the the main models that were being used by Fender. I don't know where they came up with 130 and 131 because it's a 15-inch and a 12-inch speaker, but the numbers made sense to them somehow. Well, Harvey was tired of seeing these speakers come in, and he saw that there were some small changes that he could make to the speakers that would make them less likely to blow. Because again, he's dealing with the experience of seeing blown speakers coming in, warranty repairs. So they make those changes. The first is the voice coil gap. They make it bigger so it's less likely to rub or bottom out. The second is they have this thick, oily substance that they coat the surround of the speaker in to make it tougher and to make it less likely to crack. So another thing that was happening is these speakers were seeing a lot of the natural elements, and some of them were drying out and cracking. And so they put this oily substance on the surround on the speaker to give it more strength. With those changes, it was decided to give them a different name. And so the D130 became the D130F. The D131, though there are some D131Fs, really became the D120F as far as the musical instrument realm. That one's another one that's a little confusing. Then they came out with a 10-inch version, the D110F, and they came out with a bass version of the 15 called the D140F. So there you have a bass 15, you have a regular 15, you have a 12, and you have a 10. And they even made 8-inch speakers and others that some people would even put into champs. But that was the lineup, and Fender started offering them as upgrades in their amplifiers. But it wasn't a common thing. It wasn't even really in the catalogs until later. But people soon started putting it in. And yes, to answer the question that's all burning in your mind, yes, the F stands for Fender. And it was simply because those warranty speakers were coming out of Fender amps, and they had decided to add the F on the end. So you have the F series, and that, became, kind of the standard. And, really the Dual Showman kind of became, of course, the Dual Showman had two 15s in it. That really became the big amplifier of choice for, big bands out on the road. So, even like the Rolling Stones and the Beach Boys and all sorts of guys were using Dual Showmans. Then of course you get competition from Vox was making like their Super Beatles and such, and Marshall's making their stacks. But again, they're not using the heavy duty speaker like Fender was in theirs. They weren't using JBLs. So to get the same amount of wattage, they had to use 8 speakers instead of 2. So, I don't know how cheap those Celestions were to get, early on, but that seems like a lot of pressed frame speakers. So Fender continues to offer them and even starts putting badges on the amps that come factory supplied with JBLs. So you'll notice starting in around 1968 on drip edge Fenders, you will start to see JBL badges that are in the lower right-hand corner as you're facing the amp. You'll see these badges on there, and that means that the amp, came factory equipped with, D130s, D1, again, this was in the models that didn't come naturally with a JBL. So you'll see quite a few twins with the little JBL badge on them. Now, of course, the badges were lost and, they came off. They weren't attached as well, perhaps, as the Fender logo on there, but, or sometimes they were removed. So the speaker kind of, it's a gray frame, and then it had a, oval shaped, kind of plate on there that said, James B. Lansing, had the model number and the ohmage and such. And then the big change comes in the early 70s. They begin making them with orange, they start painting the frame orange with a big, kind of black crinkly magnet. And that's, kind of, they just came up with a new look. And those are real eye-popping when you see them in the back of a Fender amp, when you see that orange frame with a black magnet. And it's here I need to say that also, with the agreement that JBL had with Fender, Fender was also distributing JBL speakers to music stores. So, if you were a Fender dealer, you could easily get JBL speakers to upgrade amps with. The next big change comes in around 1975-76. JBL upgrades the D120 and the whole line. The F line goes away and it becomes the K line. So then you get the K120, K110, etc. And that is a similar speaker, except it has a cloth surround on it, and that was to make it stronger and to handle bass frequencies more, and they also made it more efficient. So a K120, although it's about the same weight, it can handle quite a bit more wattage. So where a D120, they say it can handle 100 watts. Really, it could handle more like 40 to 50. But the K120 was more of a 80 watt or more speaker. And of course, it does sound a little different, but they do sound quite similar. So I have both a D120. So there's a D120F in my Deluxe Reverb right now, and that's what I, of course, played through at the beginning of the show. And don't be worried, guys. We're just dating at this point. I haven't gotten rid of my vintage 30. I put it in a box, but I was just been enjoying this kind of JBL journey, as it were. So I got a D120F with the original cone on it, and it's really clean, and that's what you heard. Also, I got an original cone K120, and I found that on the old eBay, and I got that, and so I had the chance to compare them, and they sounded very, very similar, except the K120 is even a little more efficient, so it seems a little louder. Also, it just seems like it has a little more, it handles low end better, so it seems like it has a little more bass, and it might have a little more treble to it. But again, it sounds very similar. The one thing I will add is that the D120 went in the back of my Deluxe Reverb without a hitch. It's close, but there was just enough, room on the studs to get the, to get those, the bolts and screws together. or the nut, was able to get it on there. However, the K120, the frame is even thicker, and so on that you would have to change out the bolts, or get a new baffle board or something like that if you're going to put it in an old amp. So so that's a note to you guys. A couple other things about JBL speakers. One is they are, for some reason, they decided to make it to where if you use the polarity that they indicate, so if you go plus to plus, minus to minus, the speaker will actually pull back instead of push forward. And they did that as, I guess, a safety concern or something like that, to make it to where it would bottom out before it went forward or something. But to me and others that I've talked to, it sounds, it sounds better, and maybe that's a placebo effect. But anyway, if you reverse it and you put the, the plus to the minus and the minus to the plus, and you have it to where the speaker goes out like it would on most speakers. So that's one thing. Another thing I want to address is the tone thing that people, kind of say about JBL speakers, about them being harsh sounding. What I've found is they just have, they have kind of a chirp, or JD Simo called it a clang, but it's just, they just have, especially you put it on the back pick, you. So there is a kind of chirp, there's an attack to it, and I like it. I kind of describe it as the speaker really enunciates the notes well, where some speakers might do a little smearing. The JBL really puts out what you put into it. And another JBL player made this comment, said, if you suck, don't play JBL. And the reason he said that is because it is an efficient and revealing speaker. So every mistake you make, it's really going to broadcast it. It is not a forgiving speaker. So, yeah. So, and that's not to be some kind of elitist statement. Yeah, it is very a revealing speaker, and it really, yeah, it's unforgiving. All right, let's see, weight. So a lot of people have complained about the weight of JBL speakers. And again, I'm talking about the Alnico speakers from the 60s and 70s, the D120 and the K120. Those speakers were 14 or 15 pounds. Now, compared to like an old Oxford or Utah or Jensen speaker, those speakers might be 5 pounds. But most of the modern speakers that we use now that are pressed frame, like a Celestion Vintage 30, it's a 9-pound speaker. So you're talking about maybe 5 or 6 pounds more. It's not that much heavier. Now, I will say that when you jump up to the E series, which the E series was ceramic, and that came out in the 80s, the E120 weighs over 20 pounds. And that is, yeah, that does get pretty heavy. And that was, yeah, that or an EV. And an Electro Voice, EVM 12L, that's a 20-pound speaker. So yes, those do kind of get into the boat anchor range, though I think they sound great. I don't have any problem with them. Yeah, so I feel like they're not necessarily a bright speaker. I think they just have a presence. They really enunciate well, and they have a crispness to them. But if you want to call it bright, you can. Now, here's kind of a list of players that have used, JBL, speakers through the years that you might be surprised by. Now, of course, you're probably familiar with, like Duane Allman. So Duane Allman certainly used JBL speakers with his twin that he used in sessions in Muscle Shoals, and also it's believed that he used that twin with the JBL D120s on the first 2 Allman Brothers record. Then it's debated as far as like when Duane used his, kind of Les Paul rig and Marshall, head thing with the JBL. Some people say it was Cerwin Vega's, but we know that Dickie Betts absolutely used D120s with his Marshall head, with the Allman Brothers. Then also, of course, you have James Burton, who famously, he was one of the early endorsers of the Fender Vibrasonic, which was Fender's first amp with a stock JBL. He used that on tons of sessions all through the 60s. In fact, even in the late 60s, he was still using that Vibrasonic on quite a few sessions. So again, that was a, 30 watt, brown face amp with a 15-inch JBL D130. But he really got known for using twins, especially playing with Elvis. And if you listen to or see photos, you can tell it's a blackface twin with JBL speakers. You can see the silver domes shining through. And then later on, he starts using Music Man amps, and he changes to, he uses one of those little HD, 130, 210 amps. So, and in that, he had D110s or K110s that he used. So again, most of the time, James Burton was using JBL speakers throughout the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s. Then you have Albert Lee. Albert Lee used a Music Man amp with JBL speakers in it all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. First, he used HD 130 410 amp that had four, D110s in it. And then later on, he moved on to using these big, Music Man heads with 412 sized cabinets that only had two 12s in them. So they would put two K120s and make it an open back cabinet. That's a trick he learned from Clapton. So Clapton was another JBL user all through the 70s. He stopped using Marshalls after Blind Faith, and he was using, dual Showmans, up through, 73, 74. And then by the time of, 461 Ocean Boulevard and that first big tour, he's using Music Man amps. And they were using, they would open the back of the cabinets and they would only put two K120 speakers in there. So I guess it would have been D120s for the first couple of years and then K120s when they came out in 76. Even a guy like Jesse Ed Davis. Jesse Ed Davis had a 59 Tweed Bassman that had four JBLs in it. All sorts of other cats. I need to pick up my handy dandy list. Mick Taylor with the Stones. The Stones used JBL, equipped dual Showmans and twins all through the 60s and 70s. Even at times when they were touring with either Hiwatts or SVTs, many times they would record with twins with JBLs, and you could see, that silver dome shining through. Of course, Roy Nichols used, a twin with JBLs. Danny Gatton many times used JBL or even EV SRO speakers. Apparently, the amp on 88 Elmira Street was a blackface Vibrolux with two D110F, 10-inch JBL speakers. Albert Collins used JBL speakers, four of the 12-inch JBLs in his quad reverb that he used all through the years, and I think he might have switched to EVs later on, but a lot of them were D120s or even E120s. Of course, Don Rich and Buck Owens, which that's kind of obvious. Freddie King also used a quad reverb and used JBL speakers in that. Stevie Ray Vaughan used JBL speakers. He used D120s early on, then Ks, and then eventually E-series JBLs, and then he switched to EVs by around 85 or so. By that point, you see Electro Voice speakers, and you stop seeing the silver domes in the photos of his gear. Let's see. And then one that's kind of funny that this is more recent I've heard about is Eddie Van Halen. So apparently Eddie Van Halen used JBLs early on, along with other speakers. So yeah, so more guys than you would think used JBLs. And again, they were kind of the pro speaker of the time because they were much less likely to blow because they could handle more wattage and they were more stoutly made. Here I need to give credit where credit is due for information that I've used in the video. This is an excellent book. I believe it's out of print. It's called Fender Amp, The First 50 Years by John Teagle and John Sprung. Excellent book, great information. This one was good information on the Stones. This is Rolling Stones Gear by Andy Babwick and Greg Provost. So that was very handy. And then finally, and this was the most important source, this is, The Soul of Tone, Celebrating 60 Years of Fender Amps by Tom Wheeler. And Tom Wheeler was, the late Tom Wheeler was one of the great, kind of guitar historians and writers. And he was the editor of Guitar Player magazine for a time. And he had extensive info about, the whole Dick Dale thing, where Dick Dale claimed that the D130F was because of him, and Harvey Gerst said otherwise. And so who knows, but, as far as we know, it was just because of the warranty, blown speakers. Who knows? They could have been, Dick Dale speakers that he was blowing all the time. But regardless, that's that. Then I also need to thank Red Volkart, who was helpful. He's a JBL, fan and user, and also, Will Barton. So they were all, very helpful and appreciated. Again, had my my deluxe reverb, my 65 deluxe reverb with the D120F in it, and I was using my 57 Esquire, plugged straight into the amp on the bridge pickup. And hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hope you have a greater appreciation for JBL speakers. And I will say that, I've lived in Nashville since the early 90s, and I rarely played through a JBL speaker and rarely saw them. It was mainly with steel players. I would see the 15-inch speakers more than the 12s. And it took me, just recently kind of breaking down, and one came up on Craigslist. And I just decided, you know what? I'm going to get it. And so I took, luckily this was at a little shop, and it wasn't like I was having to go to someone's house, but I took my deluxe reverb and I took my Esquire with me so I could really hear what the speaker sounded like. Cause I didn't want to buy it if it wasn't, gonna, be worth putting in the amp. And so I tried it, and I was just blown away, because the Vintage 30 has a very mid-forward thing. It has a little bit of this going on, kind of like a Tube Screamer, but without killing the low end. And the JBL is much more open sounding, and it does have this crispness to the high end. So right now I'm still, dating the JBL, but I'm really enjoying that. So, all right, guys. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.